November 7th, 1943. Somewhere over northern France, the metallic thunder of 283 Republic P-47 Thunderbolts filled the cold autumn sky as they escorted American heavy bombers toward German industrial targets. Second Lieutenant William Roach of the 358th Fighter Squadron, 355th Fighter Group, scanned the horizon from his cockpit, monitoring fuel consumption with growing concern. The return leg had brought headwinds exceeding 100 miles per hour. Winds so fierce they transformed what should have been a routine escort mission into a desperate race against an emptying fuel gauge. His P-47D-2, serial number 42-22490, affectionately nicknamed Beetle, shuddered slightly as the big Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine continued its steady roar. But Roach knew the mathematics of flight, the brutal calculus of fuel consumption versus distance remaining. Through breaks in the clouds below, he spotted what appeared to be a suitable airfield. Making his final approach, wheels extended, Roach brought the 7-ton fighter down smoothly onto French soil. Only after rolling to a stop and shutting down the engine did the terrible truth become clear through the gathering crowd of uniformed men approaching with weapons drawn. He had not landed in southern England. He had mistaken a German Luftwaffe base near Caen for a friendly field. Within hours, Lieutenant Roach found himself a prisoner of war, beginning a journey that would eventually take him to Stalag Luft I. But his aircraft, Beetle, was about to embark on an entirely different journey, one that would force some of Germany's most experienced test pilots to confront uncomfortable truths about American engineering philosophy, industrial capabilities, and their own increasingly precarious tactical situation in the deteriorating air war over Europe. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of how captured American fighters became instruments of revelation for the Luftwaffe begins not with Roach's emergency landing, but with the escalating air campaign over occupied Europe and Germany's desperate need for accurate, systematic intelligence about Allied aircraft capabilities that went far beyond fragmentary combat reports submitted by pilots who had mere seconds to observe enemy fighters during violent high-speed engagements. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe faced a strategic crisis that threatened to overwhelm German air defenses despite the considerable skill and courage of individual pilots. American bomber formations penetrated deeper into the Reich with each passing month, and increasingly they brought fighter escorts whose true capabilities remained partially mysterious to German commanders, making life-and-death tactical decisions based on incomplete information. Combat reports from German pilots provided valuable but fragmentary intelligence. These accounts often conflicted with one another, reflecting the chaos and confusion of aerial combat rather than systematic analysis under controlled conditions. One pilot might report that the new American fighters dove exceptionally well. Another claimed they turned poorly at low altitudes. A third insisted they possessed remarkable high-altitude performance. But without systematic testing, German tactical planners could not determine which observations reflected genuine aircraft characteristics and which represented individual pilot experience, situational factors, or misidentification under combat stress. Hauptmann Theodor Rosarius, an experienced Luftwaffe officer, understood that German fighter units needed more than scattered combat reports to counter the Allied threat effectively. They required hands-on experience with captured enemy aircraft, structured opportunities to fly these machines under controlled conditions, and systematic evaluation to discover their strengths and vulnerabilities through direct observation. The concept was not entirely new. Both Allied and German forces had tested captured aircraft throughout the war. But Rosarius would organize and systematize the approach in ways that maximized its tactical value for frontline units facing daily combat against increasingly capable American fighters. In 1943, following orders from General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland, Rosarius formed what would become known as the Wanderzirkus Rosarius. Officially designated as the second staff of the Versuchsverband Oberkommando der Luftwaffe, the Trials and Research Unit of the Luftwaffe High Command. This specialized unit received all repairable captured Allied aircraft that German salvage teams recovered from crash sites across occupied Europe. The unit's mission extended well beyond simple static testing at secure facilities. Rosarius organized traveling demonstrations where captured aircraft would visit operational Luftwaffe fighter bases, allowing frontline pilots to examine these machines up close, observe them in flight, and in carefully selected cases, fly mock combat missions against them. The recovery operation for Allied aircraft had become highly systematized by 1943, with specialized German salvage units operating across occupied territories under the direction of Bergebataillone, or salvage battalions. These teams worked with remarkable efficiency to secure crash sites, assess damage, and transport repairable aircraft to centralized facilities before advancing Allied forces could recapture the wrecks. The scale of Allied air operations over Europe made captures inevitable through sheer statistical probability. With thousands of sorties flown monthly, mechanical failures, battle damage, navigation errors, fuel exhaustion, and weather-related incidents resulted in numerous forced landings on German-controlled territory. Some pilots, recognizing their situation was hopeless, executed controlled crash landings that left their machines largely intact. Roach's P-47D fell into this category of valuable captures. The aircraft had experienced no battle damage, suffered no mechanical failure. Simple navigation error and fuel exhaustion had delivered into German hands the first complete and flyable Republic P-47 Thunderbolt the Luftwaffe had ever seen. German recovery teams reached Beetle within hours of Roach's landing. They examined the massive fighter carefully, marveling at its size and construction. The P-47 dwarfed German fighters. It weighed approximately 7 tons empty, nearly double the empty weight of a Messerschmitt Bf 109. Fully loaded with pilot, fuel, ammunition, and external stores, the Thunderbolt could exceed 8.5 tons, making it one of the heaviest single-engine fighters in operational service anywhere in the world during 1943. The Luftwaffe wisely chose to move the Thunderbolt inland immediately, away from the coast where roaming Allied fighters might spot and destroy the valuable prize with strafing attacks before German engineers could learn its secrets. American markings were quickly replaced with German national insignia. Large black crosses adorned the wings. A swastika marked the tail. The fuselage retained Roach's squadron markings and the name Beetle painted on the cowling, but bright yellow paint covered the undersurfaces and wingtips, the standard Luftwaffe colour for captured aircraft used in evaluation roles. On November 14, 1943, Beetle arrived at Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's premier testing and evaluation centre located approximately 100 kilometres northwest of Berlin in Mecklenburg. This facility served as Germany's equivalent to Wright Field in Ohio, or the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough in England. Every captured Allied aircraft that could be repaired to flying and condition eventually made its way to this secretive base, where German engineers dissected foreign technology, searching for weaknesses to exploit and innovations to copy or counter. Rechlin employed hundreds of technicians, engineers, test pilots, and support personnel dedicated to understanding how enemy aircraft worked and how to defeat them. The facility included extensive workshops equipped with specialized tools, comprehensive test ranges for various evaluation protocols, and runways specifically configured for evaluation flights under controlled conditions. Among the test pilots stationed at Rechlin was Flugkapitän Hans-Werner Lerche, who would become the most experienced evaluator of captured Allied aircraft during the war, eventually flying over 125 different aircraft types without a single serious accident. His engineering background, combined with exceptional natural flying ability, made him ideally suited for the demanding and potentially dangerous work of test-flying enemy aircraft without instruction manuals, checklists, or qualified instructors to provide guidance. For several weeks following Beetle's arrival at Rechlin, the Thunderbolt remained grounded while teams of specialists conducted exhaustive examinations. German engineers removed panels to study the stressed skin construction that gave the P-47 its legendary toughness. They measured skin thickness throughout the airframe, noting how American designers had reinforced critical areas while minimizing weight in less stressed sections. They analyzed alloy composition, tested rivet patterns, and examined joining techniques. Every system received detailed documentation. The electrical network, with its miles of wiring, revealed American approaches to aircraft systems integration that differed significantly from German practice. The hydraulic controls showed sophisticated valve designs and pressure regulation. The oxygen distribution system demonstrated the American understanding of high-altitude operations. The turbocharger installation, positioned in the rear fuselage with ducting running the length of the aircraft, represented a unique approach to supercharging that enabled the big fighter to maintain power at altitudes where German fighters gasped for air. Each component was photographed from multiple angles, sketched in detailed technical drawings, measured with precision instruments, and compared to equivalent German systems. Luftwaffe engineers marveled at aspects of American manufacturing philosophy revealed in the Thunderbolt's construction. The fighter demonstrated mass production techniques that German industry had never achieved. Standardized components meant parts manufactured at different factories would fit together without custom fitting. Interchangeable parts allowed damaged components to be swapped quickly in field conditions. Simplified assembly sequences reduced the skill level required for workers, allowing semi-skilled labor to build complex aircraft. Everything about the bomber's design indicated an industrial philosophy fundamentally different from German practice. Where German aircraft required skilled craftsmen to hand-fit complex components through labor-intensive processes, American fighters used standardized modules that workers could install rapidly using jigs, templates, and fixtures. The implications were staggering for German planners who understood industrial capacity. If one captured fighter showed this level of manufacturing sophistication, suggesting an industrial system optimized for volume production, how many could American factories produce monthly? The numbers, when German intelligence analysts calculated them, suggested production rates that seemed impossible yet would prove conservative. Republic Aviation's factory at Farmingdale, Long Island, was already producing P-47 seconds at rates exceeding 150 aircraft monthly by late 1943, and this figure would climb dramatically higher as production accelerated through 1944 and 1945, eventually reaching peak rates of nearly 500 Thunderbolts per month. After completing the static examination, German engineers declared the Beetle ready for flight testing. The aircraft received the Rechlin code 7-9, painted prominently on the fuselage. German test pilots approached their first encounter with the captured American fighter with professional curiosity, mixed with considerable skepticism, born from years of Luftwaffe propaganda that had consistently portrayed American aircraft as crude, mass-produced machines, prioritizing quantity over quality. The prevailing view among many German pilots, reinforced by official communications, held that American engineering focused on producing adequate numbers of acceptable aircraft rather than pursuing the engineering excellence and performance optimization that characterized the best German designs. These comfortable assumptions would begin dissolving rapidly once experienced German test pilots actually flew the Thunderbolt and discovered what American designers had achieved through careful engineering married to industrial pragmatism. Lerche climbed into Beetle's spacious cockpit for one of the early evaluation flights. The first impression struck him immediately. The cockpit was enormous compared to the cramped confines of the Bf 109 that most German fighter pilots flew. A pilot could actually move, adjust position, and reach controls without contorting. The seat was comfortable, almost luxurious by fighter standards, designed for missions that might last several hours rather than the 45 to 90-minute endurance typical of German fighters. The instrument panel layout impressed German pilots familiar with sometimes haphazard German cockpit arrangements that varied significantly between aircraft types and even between production batches of the same type. American designers had created a logical, standardized layout with clearly marked gauges, sensibly grouped by function. Instruments used consistent symbology and scaling. Critical information was positioned within easy view. Less frequently referenced systems were relegated to secondary positions. The overall effect reduced pilot workload significantly, allowing concentration on tactical situations rather than struggling to locate and interpret instruments during high-stress combat. But navigating the unfamiliar cockpit without instruction manuals or training presented challenges. Roach studied the various levers, switches, and controls, making educated guesses about their functions based on position, markings, and comparison to known German systems. The flap control system initially baffled him. The flaps operated hydraulically with some form of compensation mechanism, but understanding precisely how the system functioned required careful experimentation at safe altitude, where mistakes would not prove immediately fatal. The throttle operated in reverse fashion compared to German fighters. Forward motion increased power rather than decreasing it, a difference requiring conscious attention to avoid potentially catastrophic errors during critical phases of flight like takeoff and landing. The propeller controls, the mixture settings, the supercharger operation all demanded study and cautious testing before Roach felt confident enough to push the aircraft through its performance envelope. Despite these challenges, Roach noted with grudging appreciation that American designers had provided visual aids throughout the cockpit. Instruments featured red and green sections, indicating acceptable operating ranges for critical parameters like manifold pressure, cylinder head temperature, and oil pressure. This thoughtful detail allowed pilots to monitor engine health at a glance without memorizing specific numerical values, another example of design philosophy that prioritized pilot effectiveness. When Roach finally advanced the throttle for his first takeoff in Beetle, the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine responded with smooth, progressive power delivery. The 18-cylinder, twin-row radial engine produced 2,000 horsepower at military power settings, driving a massive four-bladed Curtiss electric propeller through reduction gearing. The takeoff roll was surprisingly short for such a heavy aircraft, clear testimony to the engine's substantial power output and the effectiveness of the propeller design. Once airborne, the Thunderbolt demonstrated handling characteristics that fundamentally challenged what German test pilots had been told to expect from American fighters. The flight controls felt heavy compared to the light, responsive controls of German fighters, but they were beautifully harmonized. Aileron, elevator, and rudder forces balanced properly across the entire speed range. The aircraft did not become excessively heavy at high speeds or dangerously light at low speeds. Control response was predictable, progressive, linear, exactly what a pilot needed during violent combat maneuvering, where split-second reactions determined survival. The P-47 could be thrown aggressively into various maneuvers without displaying dangerous characteristics. It did not snap into spins. It did not exhibit wing drop during stalls. The controls provided clear feedback about the aircraft's energy state without requiring constant attention to instruments. An experienced pilot could fly the Thunderbolt by feel, sensing through control pressures and aircraft response when the machine approached its performance limits. German test pilots systematically evaluated performance through carefully planned test flights designed to reveal strengths, limitations, and any hidden dangerous characteristics. What they discovered about the P-47's performance capabilities generated both admiration and concern about tactical implications. Low-altitude performance disappointed German evaluators, initially, confirming some of their preconceptions about American fighter design priorities. Below 15,000 feet, the Thunderbolt felt sluggish and heavy, its massive weight working against it in the denser air at lower altitudes. The climb rate at sea level measured approximately 2,400 feet per minute, respectable but not impressive compared to lighter German fighters. The Bf-109G could achieve nearly 3,400 feet per minute in initial climb, giving German fighters a significant advantage in the vertical plane during low-altitude combat. Turn performance at low altitudes similarly favored German fighters. The Thunderbolt's high wing, loading the ratio of weight to wing area, meant it could not match the sustained turn rate of the Bf-109 or the Focke-Wulf 190 at moderate speeds. In traditional turning dogfights at altitudes below 10,000 feet, where much early war combat had occurred. The P-47 would find itself at a measurable disadvantage against skilled German pilots who understood how to exploit their aircraft's superior maneuverability. But as test pilots pushed the Thunderbolt higher into the thin air above 20,000 feet, the aircraft transformed completely. Here, the sophisticated turbocharger installation revealed its purpose and its brilliance. The exhaust-driven turbocharger, mounted in the rear fuselage with elaborate ducting feeding compressed air forward to the engine, allowed the R-2800 to maintain sea-level power output to altitudes exceeding 25,000 feet. At 30,000 feet, where German fighters with single-stage superchargers struggled with reduced power and degraded performance, the Thunderbolt retained robust engine output and excellent handling characteristics. The tactical implications troubled German pilots who understood that American bomber formations typically operated between 25,000 and 30,000 feet, precisely where the Thunderbolt excelled and German fighters struggled. The P-47 could climb efficiently to bomber altitudes, fight effectively throughout the combat, and maintain power reserves for emergency situations. German interceptors, meanwhile, arrived at those altitudes with engines labouring, reduced speed, and compromised manoeuvrability, as their power plants gasped for sufficient oxygen in the thin atmosphere. Speed trials conducted under controlled conditions at various altitudes revealed capabilities that exceeded German intelligence estimates. The P-47D could achieve approximately 428 miles per hour at optimal altitude around 30,000 feet, with the engine running at military power settings. This represented a substantial speed advantage over the Messerschmitt Bf 109G's approximately 386 miles per hour and competitive performance against the Focke-Wulf 190A's approximately 408 miles per hour when measured under comparable conditions. More impressive still was the Thunderbolt's performance in high-speed dives. German test pilots discovered that the P-47 could dive at velocities approaching the speed of sound without encountering the severe control problems that plagued many fighters at extreme speeds. The massive weight that hindered low-altitude performance became an asset in dives, allowing the Thunderbolt to accelerate rapidly. The thick wing and robust construction prevented the flutter and buffeting that could tear apart lighter aircraft. Most importantly, the controls remained effective throughout high-speed dives, allowing pilots to pull out without excessive physical effort or fighting against locked control surfaces. Luftwaffe fighter ace Kurt Bühligen, who scored 112 confirmed victories during the war, later recalled the challenge of combating P-47 seconds. The P-47 was very heavy, too heavy for some maneuvers. We would see it coming from behind and pull up fast, and the P-47 couldn't follow, and we came around and got on its tail in this way. His observation reflected sound tactical thinking based on exploiting the Thunderbolt's inferior climb performance and turn rate at lower altitudes. But Bühligen also understood the limitation of this tactic. Once the Thunderbolt pilot recognized the danger and chose to disengage, the German fighter lacked sufficient speed to pursue effectively. American pilots quickly learned to exploit the P-47's strengths while avoiding situations that emphasized its weaknesses. Rather than accepting turning fights at medium altitudes where German fighters held advantages, Thunderbolt pilots used speed and dive performance to maintain energy throughout combat. They would make high-speed slashing attacks, fire quick bursts, then extend away using superior speed before German fighters could respond effectively. If German pilots attempted to pursue by diving, the P-47 could outdive them. If German fighters tried to climb for altitude advantage, the Thunderbolt at high altitude could outclimb them. This tactical flexibility, the ability to dictate engagement terms according to advantage, proved decisive in actual combat operations. German pilots discovered they could not force combat on Thunderbolt pilots who recognized unfavorable situations and chose to disengage. The American fighters could simply accelerate away, opening distance faster than pursuing German aircraft could close it. This fundamental inability to force decisive combat against unwilling opponents undermined German tactical doctrine that had served well earlier in the war, but now faced American fighters with performance advantages in the categories that mattered most for the strategic mission of bomber escort. But the aspect of the Thunderbolt that most impressed and troubled German test pilots was not its performance envelope or handling characteristics. It was the aircraft's almost incomprehensible structural strength and damage tolerance that seemed to defy everything German engineers understood about fighter design philosophy. The revelation came not from flight testing alone, but from examining combat damage reports and eventually witnessing firsthand the Thunderbolt's ability to absorb punishment that would destroy equivalent German fighters. German engineering philosophy emphasized optimization, extracting maximum performance from minimum weight through precise calculation and refined design. German fighters were built to exact specifications with careful attention to weight distribution and structural efficiency. They were sophisticated machines that performed beautifully when properly maintained and operated within design limits. But this optimization came at a cost. German fighters possessed limited damage tolerance. Relatively minor battle damage could compromise structural integrity or disable critical systems, forcing pilots to abandon aircraft that might have been repairable with more robust construction. American engineering philosophy, as revealed in the Thunderbolt's design, took an entirely different approach. American designers deliberately over-engineered critical structures, building in substantial safety margins that accepted higher empty weight in exchange for survivability that kept aircraft and pilots in combat longer. The P-47's airframe was massively built compared to German practice. Formers and stringers used heavier gauge aluminum than seemed necessary by German standards. Skin thickness exceeded what calculations suggested as minimum acceptable values. Structural joints incorporated redundancy that German engineers considered wasteful. The radial engine configuration itself provided inherent damage tolerance advantages compared to liquid-cooled inline engines. The Pratt & Whitney R2800, with 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows around the crankcase, could lose multiple cylinders to battle damage and continue producing power. There was no vulnerable cooling system to be punctured, no glycol to leak away, no water jackets to be holed by shell fragments. Individual cylinders could be shot away entirely, leaving the aircraft controllable and the engine operational, albeit at reduced power. German intelligence reports from frontline units began documenting Thunderbolt survivability that seemed almost incredible. Pilots reported P-47 seconds returning to base with massive holes in wings and fuselage, with control surfaces partially shot away, with engine cylinders visibly damaged, with propeller blades bent or hold damage that would have brought down a Bf-109 or WWII, yet the Thunderbolt kept flying, kept fighting, and brought its pilot home. Luftwaffe ace Heinz Baer, who achieved 220 confirmed victories, acknowledged grudgingly after the war that the P-47 could absorb an astounding amount of lead and had to be handled very carefully. His choice of words, astounding, captured the genuine surprise German pilots experienced when their cannon fire, which should have destroyed the target, instead seemed merely to anger it. One documented incident that circulated among German fighter units involved a P-47 that took a direct hit from an 88mm flak shell near Saarbrücken. The projectile struck the left wing root, shredding the wing attachment structure, fuselage, and left flaps. The pilot, First Lieutenant Leslie Bowes of the 358th Fighter Group, maintained control and flew the crippled aircraft back to his base, landed successfully, and walked away. Ground crews examining the damage expressed astonishment that the aircraft had remained airborne at all, much less completed a flight of over 50 miles in such condition. The Thunderbolt was quickly repaired and returned to combat operations. Another incident involved Lieutenant Edwin Wright of the 404th Fighter Group, who completed his 39th mission with a hole in his propeller measuring 8 inches in diameter from flak damage. If the damage had been positioned slightly differently, just 1.5 inches to either side, the blade would have severed completely, and Wright would have certainly crashed. The fact that he not only survived but continued flying combat missions testified to both luck and the fundamental robustness of the Thunderbolt's construction. Perhaps the most remarkable survival story involved a Brazilian pilot, Lieutenant Leonidas Soares Canario, flying with the 1st Fighter Group of the Brazilian Air Force in Italy during 1945. During a strafing run on a German-held industrial facility, Canario's P-47 struck a factory chimney at high speed. The impact cleanly severed 128 centimeters, approximately 4 feet of his right wing. Miraculously, the Thunderbolt continued flying despite the catastrophic asymmetric damage. Canario pulled up sharply to gain altitude and attempted to take cover behind patrolling Spitfires. However, because his radio had been damaged in the collision, Canario could not inform the Spitfire pilots of his identity. Seeing a damaged fighter approaching from behind, the Spitfire pilots assumed he was a German aircraft and opened fire, inflicting additional damage to the already crippled P-47. Despite losing 4 feet of wing and sustaining further damage from friendly fire, Canario successfully landed at the Allied airfield at Pisa. While repair crews initially declared the aircraft fit only for the scrapyard, Canario insisted it could be repaired. The Thunderbolt was indeed restored to flying condition, and Canario flew it for another 50 missions before the war ended. These accounts were not isolated incidents or exaggerated war stories. Photographic evidence documented numerous P-47 seconds that returned to base with damage that should have been fatal. Wings with holes large enough to climb through, fuselages with entire sections of skin torn away, tail surfaces partially destroyed, engine cowlings shredded by cannon fire with cylinders visibly damaged. Yet in each case, the Thunderbolt had brought its pilot home. German test pilots at Rechlin began to understand that American designers had created not merely a fighter aircraft, but a survivability system that accepted weight penalties in exchange for keeping pilots alive and aircraft operational. Despite battle damage that would doom lighter, more optimized designs, the implication was sobering. Even if German pilots achieved hits on Thunderbolts during combat, even if their cannons struck home and their shells exploded against American aircraft, there was no guarantee the target would go down. The Thunderbolt's firepower similarly impressed German evaluators who understood the tactical significance of overwhelming offensive capability. The P-47 carried 8 Browning M2 machine guns of 50 caliber, 4 mounted in each wing. This represented more guns than any other single-engine American fighter, and double the armament of typical German fighters, which carried 2 or 3 guns of various calibers mounted in the nose. Each Browning M2 fired at approximately 800 rounds per minute, with effective range exceeding 1,000 yards against aerial targets. The 50 caliber projectile delivered 3 times the kinetic energy of German 7.92 mm rounds, and comparable energy to German 13 mm heavy machine guns. A 2-second burst from all 8 guns placed approximately 213 heavy projectiles into the target area, creating a cone of fire that could shred lightly armored fighters and bombers alike. German fighters, by contrast, typically carried much lighter armament. The Bf-109 G6 variant that formed the backbone of German fighter defenses in 1944 mounted one 20mm MG 151 cannon firing through the propeller hub and two 13mm MG 131 machine guns mounted above the engine. Total firing rate from all 3 weapons combined was approximately 2,200 rounds per minute. While the 20mm cannon fired explosive shells that could destroy bombers with relatively few hits, the low ammunition capacity, only 200 rounds for the cannon, meant pilots exhausted their most effective weapon after approximately 12 seconds of sustained fire. The Thunderbolt, meanwhile, carried approximately 3,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition distributed across all 8 guns, providing approximately 34 seconds of sustained fire time. This meant American pilots could engage multiple targets during a single mission, could fire longer bursts to ensure hits, and retained ammunition reserves for defensive situations or targets of opportunity encountered returning to base. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. German intelligence analysts understood that the Thunderbolt represented not just individual engineering excellence, but a complete manufacturing philosophy, prioritizing production volume and pilot survivability over absolute performance. Optimization. Every design decision reflected this philosophy. Heavy structure accepted weight penalties for damage tolerance. Radial engine configuration traded streamlining for reliability and battle damage resistance. 8 machine guns provided overwhelming firepower at the cost of weight and complexity. Standardized components enabled mass production, but sometimes resulted in overbuilt assemblies where custom optimization might have saved weight. This American approach stood in stark contrast to German practice. German fighters represented sophisticated optimization, extracting maximum performance from minimum resources through careful design and precision manufacturing. They were beautiful, machines that performed exceptionally when everything worked correctly. But this optimization created vulnerability. When systems failed or battle damage occurred, German fighters often could not continue fighting or even reach friendly territory. The production numbers told a devastating story about relative industrial capacity. By late 1943, Republic Aviation was producing P-47 seconds at rates exceeding 150 aircraft monthly, and this figure would eventually exceed 400 per month at peak production during 1945. Between 1942 and 1945, Republic manufactured 15,683 Thunderbolts from a single factory complex at Farmingdale, Long Island. This represented more than twice Germany's total production of all single-engine fighter types combined during the same period. Moreover, these Thunderbolts were being produced with consistent quality, using assembly line methods that maintained tight tolerances across thousands of individual aircraft. American factories employed semi-skilled workers, many of them women entering industrial work for the first time, who could build complex fighters using jigs, templates, and fixtures that eliminated the need for custom fitting. German production, increasingly dispersed to avoid Allied bombing and increasingly reliant on forced labor working under terrible conditions, struggled to maintain quality standards as the war progressed. After completing comprehensive testing at Rechlin, Beetle was transferred to the Wanderzirkus Rosarius, receiving new Luftwaffe markings coded T9 plus FK. The bright yellow undersurfaces and tail marked it clearly as a test aircraft to prevent German anti-aircraft units or fighters from attacking it by mistake during demonstration flights to frontline bases. Throughout late 1943 and into 1944, the Wanderzirkus Rosarius took captured Thunderbolts on an extensive tour of operational Luftwaffe fighter bases across Germany and occupied territories. At each stop, German fighter pilots received comprehensive demonstrations designed to familiarize them with American fighter capabilities and teach specific tactics for countering Allied strengths while exploiting whatever weaknesses could be found. The demonstrations typically began with the captured aircraft taxiing past assembled German pilots and ground personnel, creating surreal scenes as enemy aircraft bearing German markings moved among German fighters. Seeing these machines up close had substantial psychological impact, making the enemy tangible and real rather than abstract. The sheer size of the Thunderbolt impressed observers accustomed to more compact German fighters. Standing next to a P-47, German pilots understood viscerally the massive engineering effort and industrial capacity required to produce such machines in quantity. Flight demonstrations followed, with experienced test pilots putting the Thunderbolt through aerobatic routines and tactical maneuvers designed to show its performance capabilities. High-speed passes at low altitude dramatically demonstrated the speed advantage American fighters possessed over German types at many combat situations. Climbing demonstrations to altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet illustrated the remarkable high-altitude capability enabled by the turbocharger. Roll demonstrations showed the P-47's excellent lateral control response, despite its size and weight. After the flying displays concluded, pilots and ground personnel could approach the aircraft, examine it closely, inspect the cockpit layout, and ask detailed questions of test pilots who had extensive experience flying the captured machine. These hands-on educational sessions proved invaluable for demystifying enemy aircraft and providing concrete understanding of what German pilots would face in actual combat. The most valuable component of base visits involved mock combat sessions, where captured American fighters engaged German fighters in carefully controlled simulated combat under observation. Selected experienced German pilots would fly their own operational aircraft against the Thunderbolt, experiencing firsthand how the American fighter handled in dynamic situations and learning what tactics proved effective or ineffective. German test pilots flying the P-47 inches. These exercises would demonstrate tactics that American pilots typically employed in actual combat, using speed and dive performance to maintain energy throughout engagements while avoiding sustained turning fights where German fighters held advantages. German pilots flying Bf-109s and FW-190s attempted to engage using standard Luftwaffe tactics that had proven effective against earlier Allied fighters. They quickly discovered the extreme difficulty of forcing combat on a Thunderbolt, whose pilot understood energy management and properly utilized the aircraft's performance advantages. When German pilots pursued aggressively at medium altitudes, the P-47 would simply accelerate away, opening distance faster than the pursuing German fighters could close it. When German pilots attempted to climb for altitude advantage, the Thunderbolt at high altitude would outclimb them, reversing the tactical situation. When German pilots tried to force sustained turning fights where the Bf-109 held advantages, the P-47 pilot would refuse engagement by extending away using superior speed, then reversing back with renewed energy advantage when conditions favored attack. These mock combat sessions proved sobering for German pilots who had hoped that their aircraft and established tactics remained reasonably competitive despite the deteriorating strategic situation. Directly experiencing the Thunderbolt's capabilities in dynamic maneuvering demonstrated clearly that American pilots flying P-47 seconds possessed significant tactical advantages, particularly at the high altitudes where bomber escort combat typically occurred. Walter Wolfram, a German fighter pilot who survived the war with multiple combat victories, had the opportunity to fly captured P-47 seconds during Wanderzirkus demonstrations. His assessment was blunt. During the war, I had the opportunity to fly captured P-47 seconds and P-51 seconds. I didn't like the Thunderbolt. It was too big. The cockpit was immense and unfamiliar. After so many hours in the snug confines of the 109, everything felt out of reach and too far away from the pilot. Wolfram's reaction captured a common initial response among German pilots, transitioning from compact fighters to the massive Thunderbolt. But his personal preference did not diminish his professional recognition of the P-47's capabilities. He understood that American pilots who trained exclusively in Thunderbolts did not share his discomfort with the spacious cockpit, and that the aircraft's size came with advantages in firepower, fuel capacity, and damage tolerance that German fighters could not match. Hans-Werner Lersch, who flew Beetle and other captured Thunderbolts extensively, provided more technical assessment in his post-war memoir. He was particularly impressed by the P-47's strength in dives, noting that this capability probably saved his life during a high-altitude test flight where oxygen supply proved insufficient. At altitudes between 9,000 and 11,000 meters, approximately 30,000 to 36,000 feet, Lersch experienced hypoxia, the insidious oxygen deprivation that causes confusion and unconsciousness at extreme altitudes. He found himself at 4,000 meters, 13,000 feet, with the engine throttled back and no clear memory of how he had descended. The Thunderbolt had survived an uncontrolled high-speed dive from above 30,000 feet without structural failure, flutter, or control surface damage. Lersch carefully restarted the engine, which had windmilled to a stop during the dive, and flew back to Rechlin safely. Reflecting on the incident later, he wrote that the Thunderbolt's exceptional strength in high-speed flight probably prevented catastrophic structural failure during the dive, while he was incapacitated. Lerche also noted the P-47's impressive performance at high altitudes, writing, "The P-47 was excellent in higher altitudes, in diving attacks and flying at maximum boost." This assessment, coming from an experienced test pilot who had flown over 125 different aircraft types during the war, carried considerable weight among German aviators seeking objective information about enemy capabilities. The Germans captured at least 2 additional P-47 Thunderbolts during 1944, each following similar patterns of recovery, repair, and evaluation. On May 29, 1944, 2nd Lieutenant Lloyd Hathcock of the 301st Fighter Squadron became disoriented during a mission over Italy and mistakenly landed at a German-controlled airfield near Rome. His P-47, serial number 42-75971, had previously served as the personal mount of 8 Victory Ace George Novotny of the 317th Fighter Squadron before being reassigned. This second captured Thunderbolt, designated T9 plus LK by the Wanderzirkus Rosarius, quickly made its way to Rechlin for evaluation. The bright yellow undersurfaces and tail markings identified it clearly as a test aircraft. Among the many Luftwaffe pilots who test flew T9 plus LK was Hans Werner Lersch, who by this point had accumulated substantial experience with American fighters and could provide comparative assessments based on direct flight experience rather than theoretical analysis or combat observations. The Germans also reportedly used at least 1 captured P-47 for photo reconnaissance missions over England in the months leading up to the D-Day invasion in June 1944. Flying at high altitude over the English Channel and southern England, the Thunderbolt in German markings could potentially pass for a returning American fighter long enough to photograph invasion preparations, troop concentrations, and supply depots. Whether these reconnaissance missions actually occurred remains somewhat unclear in surviving records, but the Thunderbolt's long-range and high-altitude capability certainly made it suitable for such operations if German intelligence deemed the risk acceptable. By October 12, 1944, captured Thunderbolt T9 plus LK was transferred from Rechlin to the Wanderzirkus Rosarius for demonstration tours to frontline units. The aircraft visited numerous Luftwaffe bases across Germany, providing the same comprehensive familiarization training that Beetle had delivered a year earlier. German pilots examined the massive fighter up close, observed demonstration flights, and when possible participated in mock combat exercises designed to teach effective tactics against American escorts. The photographs taken during these demonstration visits show German pilots and ground crews crowded around the captured Thunderbolt, examining every detail of its construction. Mechanics studied the engine installation, noting how American designers had packaged the massive R2800 radial engine with its accessories, exhaust system, and cooling arrangements. Pilots sat in the cockpit, familiarizing themselves with instrument layouts and control positions. Intelligence officers took detailed notes about performance characteristics, tactical recommendations, and pilot observations. These demonstrations continued into 1945, as long as aviation fuel remained available in sufficient quantities, and operational airfields could be maintained against Allied ground advances from both east and west. But by early 1945, the program's effectiveness had diminished significantly, not because the intelligence was flawed, but because Germany's strategic situation had deteriorated beyond any tactical innovation's ability to compensate. The Luftwaffe suffered from chronic and worsening fuel shortages that severely limited flight training hours for new pilots, resulting in inadequately prepared aviators being sent into combat with minimal experience. Pilots who understood through hard-won combat experience how to fight effectively against aircraft like the P-47 were increasingly rare, lost to relentless attrition during the brutal air combat of 1944 that saw German fighter pilot losses reach unsustainable levels. Aircraft production, while remaining surprisingly high despite intensive Allied strategic bombing of German industry, could not replace losses quickly enough to maintain force strength. Most critically, the training revelations from captured aircraft demonstrations often served primarily to demoralize rather than inspire, as pilots realized the full extent of their disadvantages. German pilots recognized with growing clarity that they flew inferior aircraft, or at minimum aircraft inferior in the most critical performance categories for the missions they were assigned. The P-47's advantages in dive speed, high-altitude performance, firepower, and especially damage tolerance could not be matched by any available German fighters in operational service. The FAR W190D9 Dora variant, introduced in autumn 1944, offered improved high-altitude performance through its liquid-cooled Junkers Jumo 213 inline engine, but it arrived too late and in too few numbers to alter strategic outcomes. Even more advanced German designs under development, the Focke-Wulf-Tar 152 high-altitude fighter, various heavily armed bomber-destroyer variants, and revolutionary jet-powered aircraft like the Messerschmitt Me-262 could not overcome the fundamental arithmetic of industrial production and pilot training that determined air superiority over Europe during the war's final year. The broader implications of German pilots directly experiencing superior American fighters extended well beyond immediate tactical considerations. The Thunderbolt represented tangible, undeniable evidence that American industrial and engineering capabilities equaled or exceeded German achievements in critical areas, contradicting years of propaganda about American technical inferiority. This uncomfortable realization challenged fundamental assumptions about relative national capabilities and contributed significantly to declining morale among German pilots, who increasingly understood they fought at severe and growing disadvantages that no amount of skill, courage, or tactical cleverness could fully overcome. The Thunderbolt's damage tolerance similarly troubled German pilots by undermining their offensive effectiveness. Even successful hits might not bring down the aircraft. Luftwaffe after-action reports documented numerous instances where German pilots reported scoring hits on Thunderbolts with 20mm or 30mm cannon fire, seeing pieces fly off the American aircraft, yet watching the P-47 continue flying apparently unaffected. These reports initially generated skepticism among intelligence officers who suspected pilot overclaiming or misidentification. But as similar accounts accumulated from multiple units across different theaters, German commanders had to accept that American fighters possessed damage tolerance beyond anything German engineering had achieved or even attempted. The radial engine configuration proved especially frustrating for German pilots accustomed to targeting cooling systems on liquid-cooled fighters. Puncturing a radiator or coolant line on a Spitfire, Hurricane, or Mustang would cause engine temperatures to rise rapidly, forcing the pilot to reduce power or risk catastrophic engine failure. But hitting a P-47's radial engine with machine gun fire might damage individual cylinders without disabling the entire power plant. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 could lose multiple cylinders and continue producing power sufficient to bring the aircraft home. German intelligence analysts calculated that destroying a Thunderbolt reliably required either catastrophic structural damage, severing control surfaces, breaking the wing structure, or penetrating the cockpit and killing the pilot, or achieving multiple solid hits with 30mm cannon shells in critical areas. 20mm cannon fire, while effective against most fighters, proved marginal against the heavily built P-47 unless hits concentrated in vulnerable systems. Machine gun fire of 13mm or smaller caliber was largely ineffective against the Thunderbolt unless German pilots achieved perfect shot placement or extended bursts at close range. This meant German fighters needed to close to point-blank range, typically inside 400 yards, to ensure effective hits with available weapons. But closing to such ranges exposed German pilots to the Thunderbolt's 850 caliber machine guns, which could inflict devastating damage to lightly built German fighters from ranges exceeding 800 yards. The tactical geometry favored American pilots who could engage at longer ranges, fire longer bursts, and disengage before German fighters could close to their more effective shorter ranges. Production statistics amplified German concerns about the strategic implications. By 1944, American factories were producing approximately 400 P-47 seconds monthly at peak rates, and this figure represented only one of several fighter types in large-scale production. North American aviation simultaneously built P-51 Mustangs at comparable rates. Lockheed produced P-38 Lightnings. Grumman manufactured F-6F Hellcats for the Navy. Republic alone would ultimately produce 15,683 Thunderbolts between 1942 and 1945, more aircraft than Germany's entire single-engine fighter production during the same period across all manufacturers and all types combined. Moreover, American production maintained consistently high quality through sophisticated manufacturing processes that German industry, increasingly disrupted by Allied bombing and increasingly reliant on inadequately trained forced labor, could not match. American P-47 seconds rolled off assembly lines with properly fitted components, reliable systems, accurate instruments, and functioning radio equipment. German fighters by late 1944 suffered from inconsistent quality as dispersed manufacturing, material shortages, and workforce disruptions degraded production standards. The quality gap extended beyond manufacturing to maintenance and logistics. American P-47 seconds, operating from bases in England and later from captured airfields in France, received proper maintenance from well-trained ground crews with adequate supplies of genuine spare parts, proper tools, and technical manuals. German fighters struggled with increasingly severe maintenance challenges created by parts shortages, substitute materials of inferior quality, undertrained or forced labor personnel, and dispersed maintenance facilities lacking proper equipment. American pilot training similarly exceeded German capabilities by 1944. American pilots typically arrived at operational units with 200 to 400 hours of total flight training time, including extensive instruction in advanced combat tactics, instrument flying under various weather conditions, and formation procedures. They had practiced gunnery against towed targets until achieving proficiency. They had learned emergency procedures until reactions became automatic. They understood their aircraft's capabilities and limitations through systematic instruction rather than trial and error in combat. German pilot training had been dramatically and dangerously shortened by late 1944 due to severe fuel shortages and the loss of training facilities and experienced instructors to combat attrition. New pilots sometimes arrived at frontline units with barely 100 hours total flight time, minimal combat training, and often no instrument training whatsoever. They had fired their guns at ground targets perhaps, but rarely at realistic aerial targets at realistic combat ranges and closure rates. They understood basic aircraft handling but lacked the nuanced understanding of energy management, tactical geometry, and situational awareness that distinguished survivors from casualties. These inadequately trained pilots faced veteran American pilots flying objectively superior aircraft. The combination produced grimly predictable results reflected in German loss statistics. German loss rates among fighter pilots increased dramatically and unsustainably during 1944 and early 1945. Experienced pilots who understood through hard-won combat experience how to maximize their aircraft's remaining strengths while minimizing exposure to enemy advantages were killed or seriously wounded faster than replacement. Pilots could be trained even under compressed and inadequate training programs. New pilots with minimal training survived only a handful of missions on average before being shot down. Some died on their first or second combat sortie, never having the opportunity to learn the lessons that might have kept them alive longer. The Luftwaffe was hemorrhaging its most valuable and irreplaceable asset, skilled, experienced pilots with the knowledge and judgment necessary for survival and effectiveness at rates that could not possibly be sustained. The Wanderzirkus Rosarius demonstrations revealed these harsh realities directly to German pilots before they encountered them in actual combat, where the stakes were life and death. While this advanced preparation theoretically improved chances of survival by providing realistic understanding of what they would face, it simultaneously made painfully clear the deteriorating situation German forces confronted across all dimensions of the air war. The ultimate fate of the captured P-47 Thunderbolts operated by German forces remains unclear or unknown in several cases due to incomplete records and the chaos of Germany's final collapse. Beetle, the first captured P-47 coded T9 plus FK, apparently served with the Wanderzirkus Rosarius until sometime in 1944 or early 1945, before being lost to unknown causes. Historical records do not definitively specify whether the aircraft crashed during a demonstration flight, was destroyed on the ground during an Allied air raid against the airfield where it was stationed, or fell victim to other wartime circumstances. The second, captured P-47, coded T9 plus LK, was discovered by advancing American forces at Göttingen in April 1945. Photographs show American soldiers examining the Thunderbolt in German markings, the bright yellow undersurfaces and tail clearly identifying it as a test aircraft even as German forces collapsed around it. Whether this aircraft was subsequently returned to American service or scrapped is not recorded in surviving documents. The knowledge gained from systematically testing captured Thunderbolts provided German pilots with valuable tactical intelligence about aircraft capabilities, optimal engagement parameters, and exploitable weaknesses. But this knowledge ultimately could not overcome the fundamental and overwhelming disadvantages the Luftwaffe faced by 1944 and 1945. Understanding intellectually that the Thunderbolt could outdive, outrun, and absorb far more punishment than German fighters offered limited practical benefit, when German pilots still had to engage these superior aircraft in defense of German territory under direct orders, often with inadequate fuel reserves, insufficient ammunition, and against numerical odds that made survival unlikely regardless of tactical sophistication. The testing and demonstration program represented a professional and systematic attempt to counter Allied advantages through tactical innovation and improved pilot knowledge. But tactics and knowledge alone could not compensate for inferior aircraft performance in critical categories, severe numerical disadvantages, inadequate training due to fuel shortages, and chronic shortages of spare parts and experienced maintenance personnel. The story of captured P-47 Thunderbolts in German service illustrates the sophisticated approach the Luftwaffe took toward understanding enemy capabilities despite Germany's deteriorating strategic position. Rather than relying solely on fragmentary combat reports and intelligence assessments of uncertain reliability, German forces invested significant scarce resources in recovering, repairing, and systematically flying captured Allied aircraft under controlled conditions. This systematic approach to tactical intelligence gathering represented best practices for military organizations seeking to understand opponent capabilities accurately. It continued even as Germany's strategic situation became increasingly hopeless, a testimony to the professionalism and dedication of German pilots and engineers who continued executing their duties even as final defeat approached. But the program also demonstrated that even sophisticated intelligence gathering, professional competence, and systematic analysis could not overcome fundamental material and strategic disadvantages of the magnitude Germany faced. German pilots who flew captured Thunderbolts gained valuable knowledge about aircraft characteristics and optimal tactics. But that hard-won knowledge primarily confirmed what many already suspected or understood through combat experience. American aircraft possessed significant and decisive performance advantages that German industry and engineering could not match during the war's final years, given resource constraints and strategic circumstances. The P-47 represented one particularly visible manifestation of broader American advantages in industrial capacity, access to strategic resources, and increasingly sophisticated technological capabilities that matched or exceeded German achievements in the specific areas that mattered strategically. The technical sophistication of the P-47 demolished German assumptions about American engineering capabilities. German pilots who flew the Thunderbolt extensively could not dismiss American engineering as crude. They had experienced an aircraft that performed superbly in its intended mission profile. The strategic air campaign over Germany succeeded in large part because of fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt, whose unique combination of capabilities enabled escort missions deep into German territory that other aircraft could not accomplish as effectively. The combination of high-altitude performance, long-range, heavy firepower, and extraordinary damage tolerance created an aerial weapon that, when multiplied across hundreds of aircraft flying in mutually supporting formations, fundamentally changed the nature of daylight strategic bombing. By mid-1944, this reality became undeniable even to the most optimistic German commanders. The question was no longer whether Germany could win the air war over Europe. The question became how long German forces could continue fighting against increasingly overwhelming material disadvantage before collapse became inevitable. The captured Thunderbolts had taught the Luftwaffe everything they needed to know about the P-47 as a weapons system, its strengths, its weaknesses, its capabilities, its limitations. But this knowledge couldn't change the fundamental arithmetic of industrial production and pilot training that determined strategic outcomes. For every German pilot who learned to attack P-47 seconds effectively through training at recon or combat experience, the Americans trained 10 new pilots. For every Thunderbolt shot down over Germany through superior German tactics, American factories built 5 more fighters. For every successful interception that disrupted a bombing raid, a dozen more raids flew the next week with even larger formations. This American philosophy, survivability through robust over-engineering, worked because American industry could sustain losses that German forces could not. Hans-Werner Lerche survived the war and lived until 1991, long enough to publish his memoirs and participate in numerous historical projects documenting Luftwaffe test pilot experiences. He remained proud of his service and technical accomplishments while acknowledging the futility of Germany's cause and the inevitability of defeat once American industrial capacity fully mobilized. His expertise flying captured Allied aircraft made him valuable to Allied intelligence services after the war, and he contributed to several projects evaluating German and captured Allied aircraft for post-war air forces. The first captured P-47, Beetle, served Germany from November 1943 until its loss sometime during 1944 or early 1945. During that time, it taught German aviators and engineers volumes about American fighter design, damage tolerance, philosophy, and industrial capabilities. The lessons proved intellectually valuable but strategically irrelevant to changing outcomes. Understanding your enemy's advantages doesn't eliminate them or create counters when the resources don't exist. The ruggedness that so impressed German test pilots at Rechlin represented not just structural strength but American industrial philosophy made tangible. Build it strong enough to bring pilots home. Accept weight penalties for survivability. Prioritize damage tolerance over weight optimization. Design for mass production using semi-skilled labor. Create systems robust enough to function despite component failures. This philosophy worked. The Republic produced over 15,000 Thunderbolts during the war. They flew over 746,000 sorties across all theaters. They achieved an aerial kill ratio of 4.6 to 1 against all opponents, despite being employed extensively in the dangerous ground attack role where losses to anti-aircraft fire ran high. They brought their pilots home even when battle damage should have been fatal, earning eternal gratitude from men who owed their lives to the rugged construction German engineers found so impressive. Thank you for reading. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The captured P-47 Thunderbolts in German service became unwitting witnesses to their own nation's defeat. Every test flight revealed American capabilities. Every evaluation report documented American advantages. Every training exercise emphasized the same inescapable conclusion. American industrial capacity had produced an aircraft optimized for its mission, built in overwhelming numbers, flown by well-trained pilots, and tough enough to absorb punishment that would destroy equivalent German fighters. German test pilots who flew captured Thunderbolts admitted they had never encountered an aircraft with such damage tolerance in their extensive experience with various fighter types. They marveled at the structural strength that allowed pilots to survive hits that should have been fatal. They studied the construction methods that enabled such robustness without completely sacrificing performance. They understood through direct experience that American engineering had achieved something remarkable, creating a fighter that could both dish out devastating punishment and absorb terrible damage while bringing its pilot home. But admiration for the weapon did nothing to change the outcome of battles in the sky over Europe. Knowledge of enemy capabilities couldn't create the resources needed to defeat them when those resources simply didn't exist in sufficient quantities. The Thunderbolt represented American industrial power made visible in the skies over Germany. That industrial power, once unleashed and fully mobilized, proved unstoppable despite determined resistance, heroic individual efforts, and professional military competence. The 850 caliber machine guns that delivered such devastating firepower, the radial engine that kept running despite catastrophic damage, the robust airframe that absorbed punishment other fighters could not survive. These were merely the visible manifestations of deeper American advantages in industrial organization, resource availability, and economic mobilization for total war. The real lesson of the captured Thunderbolts, though it took time for all participants to fully comprehend the implications, was that modern warfare had become as much an industrial contest as a military one. Victory required not just brave pilots and sophisticated tactics, but factories that could produce weapons faster than enemies could destroy them, training systems that could prepare pilots in greater numbers than combat could eliminate them, and economic capacity that could sustain losses indefinitely while maintaining offensive operations. Germany lacked these fundamental prerequisites for victory by 1944, regardless of individual tactical successes or technological innovations. The captured Thunderbolts could teach tactics and reveal vulnerabilities, but they couldn't change strategic destiny determined by industrial capacity, resource availability, and national mobilization for total war. That was the uncomfortable truth German test pilots confronted when they flew captured P-47 seconds and admitted they had never seen such ruggedness in any fighter they had encountered before. The legacy of captured Thunderbolts tested at Rechlin demonstrated the value of systematic intelligence gathering even under the most difficult strategic circumstances. These aircraft, built in American factories, shot down or forced down by German forces, then rebuilt and flown by German pilots, served as unique windows into Allied capabilities and American industrial methods, yet they also revealed the impossibility of Germany's strategic position. Every hour spent repairing captured American aircraft diverted skilled labor from maintaining German fighters. Every gallon of precious fuel burned testing enemy aircraft was fuel unavailable for combat operations. Meanwhile, American factories produced more P-47 seconds every single day, replacing losses faster than combat could inflict them. When the guns fell silent over Europe in May 1945, that American approach had prevailed. The Thunderbolts had completed their mission. The pilots had come home,